3,300 years ago, a group of cattle herders were taking their animals along a desert route. They were making their way from watering hole to watering hole, leading their herd closer to the river in order to enjoy pasture and grazing along the edge of the Nile. These people wore a variety of garments, including animal skins for their kilts and richly colored fabrics and textiles. Their hair was worn short, cropped in a kind of bowl cut around their heads. Some of them, the wealthy, wore earrings of broad discs that stood out distinctly against their incredibly dark skin. These cattle herders were the people that we now call Nubians, living in the region of modern-day Sudan, in a land often called the Bayuda Desert. The ancient Egyptians called them the people of Irem, a land slightly outside the Egyptian Empire, but close to the frontiers, and, more importantly, not far from the gold mining country. On this day, 3,300 years ago, the clan of cattle herders saw a cloud of dust gathering upon the horizon. It was an ominous sight, not a sandstorm or any kind of natural disturbance. This was a herald of war. The people of Irem, leading their cattle from watering hole to watering hole, were suddenly in a great deal of danger. The Egyptian army, led by their monarch, the pharaoh, was coming in force. A day of battle had arrived. Salam alaikum, peace be upon you. Welcome back to the History of Egypt podcast, episode 199, The Winter War, or Sety's Last Campaign. The year was 1296 BCE, approximately. It was regnal year 8 under the majesty of King Men-Ma'at-Ra, Sety I, the pharaoh of Egypt. Things were going well for Sety. Now in his early 40s, the king had enjoyed many years of power and prosperity. He had achieved great victories on the battlefield, especially in the east, in Canaan and Syria. Now, his royal tomb in the Valley of the Kings was well underway, with the builders of Deir el-Medina hard at work on his elaborate sepulchre. Around year 8, the king was in the southern city, Waset or Thebes, enjoying the fruits of his labors and commissioning monuments for the grandeur of the gods. But as he relaxed in his splendor and comfort, the king received troubling news. There was a rebellion. Far to the south, generations of Sety's predecessors had constructed a colonial empire in the lands of Wawat and Kush. This region, which stretches across southern Egypt and modern Sudan today, was a vast expanse of territory with a sizable population of pastoral and settled communities. The Nubians, in their many distinct groups, had spent generations under the yoke of Egyptian rule. But it wasn't always a peaceful rule, and periodically there might be rebellions or attacks against the Egyptians, especially in the region of the gold mines. To the east of the Nile Valley, the hills and wadis of the desert plateau are rich in the precious metal, and for centuries before Sety, pharaohs and their representatives had stamped their authority over this land in order to control the river, exploit its population, dominate trade, and acquire gold. Now there was a threat. The rebellion, quote-unquote, flared up in a region called Irem. Unfortunately, we don't know exactly where Irem is located. Different scholars have put forth different proposals based on these scattered, fragmentary references. The most likely explanation on the current evidence is that Irem is located in a region just north of Khartoum, the capital of modern Sudan, in a land now commonly known as the Bayuda Desert. This region, which is far downriver from the Egyptian territory, is dangerously close to the gold mining country, and it's possible that the rulers or people of Irem were threatening Egyptian operations. Naturally, this would not do. and Sety would organize a response to this distant but growing threat to his empire. The event is recorded on a pair of stone stelae discovered at communities in Nubia, modern Sudan, and they describe the king's campaign. The texts are fragmentary, but still rich in detail. Quote, Year 8, the unknown month of Peret, the growing season, day 24, under the person of King Sety I and all of his titles. One day, his person was in the city quarter of Waset, Thebes or Luxor, and he was doing that which pleased his father, Amun-Ra. But then one reported to him, The enemies of the land of Irem are plotting rebellion. Now, his person, Sety, held back from acting against them. Then his person spoke to the great ones, the courtiers, and he said to them, What are the wretched ones of Irem, that they should rebel in the time of my person? It is my father Amun-Ra who shall cause them to fall to the sword of my person. Indeed, I caused every other land that acted thus to retreat before me. Then his person laid plans against them, and Sety decreed slaughter against them, so that he might strike down rebellion wherever it was. And his person dispatched the infantry, and also many chariots. End quote. News of the rebellion arrived during the season of Peret. This is the northern winter between December and March. We don't have the exact date which the message arrived, but I'm going to assume it was early in the season, because the entire war unfolded during the winter months. So perhaps around December, Sety was in Waset enjoying the warm weather and keeping away from the cold and damp of the north. But while he relaxed in his palace and oversaw his glittering monuments, the messenger was hurrying downriver with this terrible news. The author's description is surprisingly detailed, almost like a novel in the way it is structured. Sety receives the news of this distant rebellion and then considers his response. We get the sense that Pharaoh was indignant at such uprisings. Although Irem was far away and not officially part of his empire, any rebellion was a transgression against Sety's divine authority, and thus against the order created by the gods themselves. So, temporarily, Sety is irritated by their insolence. But he's not hasty. The author specifically describes Sety taking a moment to consider his best response. He waits to receive more information in order to consider his plan of action. Then, when it is time to make that decision, Sety summons his courtiers, the great ones of his kingdom, perhaps to hold council and discuss the issue with them, but ultimately the buck stops with Pharaoh, and Sety announces his decision. Sety dispatched a battalion of foot soldiers, or mesha, and chariots, or heteri, so he sent infantry and cavalry to deal with the threat at Irem. The story doesn't tell us if Sety went himself. It says that he sent them, but it doesn't say whether he actively participated in the campaign. I'm going to assume he did, but we really can't say for sure. At the very least, we can imagine the dispatch of these soldiers, the equipment they took with them, and their journey upriver. So, let us follow the army of Sety I as they depart Waset. In the winter of 1296 BCE, a fleet of ships set sail from Waset, or Thebes. Some of them were mighty vessels, made of cedar wood. They had masts with broad sails made of fabric, banks of oarsmen for rowing, and long poles at the stern for steering. Some of them had cabins amidships, in which the officers might rest, or the horses might be kept safely. But many of the ships were more like barges, carrying troop upon troop in readiness for the war ahead. On board the ships, the soldiers were preparing and checking their equipment as they set off for battle. Based on archaeological finds and artistic scenes from tombs, We can tell the infantry would be equipped with long rectangular shields with a rounded top. These were tall enough to reach from their knee to their shoulder, giving them a decent amount of protection. They would carry spears, bows, and perhaps axes or daggers. Some troops might have carried the khopesh or sickle sword, and they would be dressed relatively simply in cloth kilts and head caps made of leather or padded linen. They were led by their standard bearers or chariots, who were the battalion commanders of about 200 men each. The charioteers, meanwhile, rode on lightweight wooden carts with wheels reinforced with 6 spokes that provided additional stability and strength compared to 4 spokes in the olden days. The chariots were light, with simple hollow frames and leather stretched between the gaps to provide cover and protection. The horses wore cloth or caparisons draped over their back, and these might be brightly colored to provide visibility on the battlefield and a display against the enemy, and of course to shield them, slightly, from attack. They were colorful, with some horses even having headdresses with feathers to provide plumage and display in battle. In some cases, we even know the names of the horses. For example, Sety I had a pair of horses acting as a team, and this team was called Amun silences the 9 bows, that is, Amun subdues the enemies of Egypt. Another team was called Great of Victories in Waset, and a third was called Amun decrees bravery for the king. Sometimes they even have foreign names, like one team of horses called Anat is content, which references a Canaanite or Syrian deity called Anat. We'll meet her another time. These records give us a tiny hint at the organizational mindset of the Egyptians. Rather than naming each horse individually, they are named together as a pair, acting in unison in their role as war beasts. Perhaps they had individual names outside of conflict, but when they appear on the walls of the temples, driving the king's chariot forward against his foes, the horses act in unison, and they are united in their identity. It's an interesting way of looking at it, and it gives the chariot itself its own particular name. It must be something about human behavior, because throughout history, warriors have often named their weapons or even their war machines individually, giving them a distinct identity in battle. Perhaps it is a way to connect more strongly with the tool on which your life depends. Wherever it comes from, we see the practice here in ancient Egypt. Whatever their names, the horses were well cared for, and the chariots themselves were carefully maintained in readiness for battle. The charioteers were an elite wing of the Egyptian army, largely made up of the nobility who could afford the horses and equipment to supply the chariot force. With 2 men per war cart, they would range out ahead of the foot soldiers to provide a curtain or screen while on the march, and moving quickly to disorient or encircle the enemy during a moment of battle. All this information can be gleaned from the walls of temples, the paintings in tombs, and even the weapons and items themselves found in undisturbed burials. While Sety does not give us that many details, we can reconstruct the panoply of his army, which makes it much easier to imagine their attack. The king's forces departed Waset, or Thebes. They boarded great ships, unfurled their sails, and began the journey south. It was a long way to Irem, more than 1,000 kilometers, or 750 miles, following the twists and turns of the Nile. Along the way, the troops would have to navigate 4 rocky areas, the cataracts, that emerge from the middle of the river and cause great difficulty for traffic. In olden days, these cataracts might prove a moment of great danger, as the soldiers had to disembark and tow the ships over rocks and through narrow passages. Fortunately, these days the Egyptians maintained a series of great fortresses, at least one at every cataract, and previous generations had dug canals to circumvent the difficult rocks. So as the troops of Sety I made their voyage south, they could enjoy a safe and quiet travel, the fruits of hard-won victories. Conveniences aside, it must have been a long and tedious journey, several weeks of sailing at least, with the horses getting frustrated, the men getting bored, and the further south they went, the danger increasing. Surprisingly, the ancient author describing this campaign skips over all of that journey. From the moment Sety dispatches his troops, we next hear about their arrival. Quote, "Arrival was made by his person's army at the fortress called Pacifier of the Two Lands, in the 4th month of Peret on day 21. Then one marshalled against the enemy, with the strong arm of the Pharaoh before them like a blast of fire crushing the mountains. 7 days passed, and the dawn came, and the strong arm of Men Ma'at Ra had carried the enemy away, without missing even one of them, men and women alike. He, the king, plundered 5 wells in the space of a moment. The names of these wells are Tipau, Takebnu, Tairosu, Kurukasa, and Tusarosu. The crowd of enemies was brought to the riverbank as prisoners, and all of their cattle were in droves before them as the booty of Pharaoh, life, prosperity, health." End quote. The campaign itself is reasonably short, 7 days of effort, and then the enemy are defeated. The Egyptian strategy seems to have focused on the wells. The author lists these watering holes individually and even gives us their names. We can imagine the Egyptian army moving systematically from well to well in order to deny their foe easy access to water. The importance of these wells is conveyed through their names. The names are not Egyptian, suggesting that the scribe has spoken to locals, like interpreters, in order to get the name of each watering hole and then translated it into Egyptian hieroglyphs. It's an interesting example of geographic note-taking. And it's something that we've seen before in the days of Sety I, when the king led his first campaign across the Sinai Peninsula. His artists working at Karnak specifically labeled the wells and fortresses that he passed along his route. It seems like Sety's government was particularly interested in these kind of details, and even if the king himself was not present on campaign, his representatives were keeping tidy records. The speed of the fight suggests that Irem was not a major power or a great kingdom that could marshal significant forces for huge and bloody battles. That sense of a smaller scale conflict is confirmed in the next and final section of the text, in which the author describes the prisoners that the Egyptian army captured. Quote, "List of the plunder which was brought back from the wretched land of Irem. Total prisoners 434 individuals, with 48 children, 66 young women, 54 young men, 33 people of unknown category, and an unknown number, but possibly 233, male Nubians." End quote. Compared to major campaigns in Libya, Canaan, Syria, and even earlier generations coming into Nubia, this Irem conflict seems to have been a pretty small affair. From the entire population, not counting the dead, the scribe records fewer than 500 individuals. The author is still proud of this victory and divides the prisoners up into their respective categories. What happened to them afterwards, we do not know. The writer simply says that the prisoners were gathered up on the riverbank, along with their cattle, in order to be counted and taken away. Most likely, many of them went north to the great farming estates of Egypt itself and in northern Nubia. The men might be recruited as warriors, but many of them were probably sent to act as laborers and farmers. This kind of mass deportation was a common feature of ancient war. It is certainly not unique to the Egyptians. But the pharaoh's campaigns in Nubia are noteworthy for the removal of entire populations for their economic and military benefit. We'll talk more about the empire in Nubia in coming generations, especially during the reign of Ramesses II. For now, the Irem campaign under Sety I wrapped up relatively quickly and with a surprisingly small number of captives. The speed of the victory and the relatively minor stakes of the group involved does raise certain questions about the ancient author's account. Sety's representative, describing these events, calls the conflict at Irem a rebellion or beshtu. That is a very loaded term. The word rebellion suggests that, at least in concept, the people of Irem were considered to be part of the Pharaonic Empire, legitimate subjects of Sety's authority. In that sense, any hostility, any action against Sety's wishes, would be a transgression against the divine order that the gods had laid down and which the pharaoh upheld. In other words, the Iremite conflict was a criminal act against a legitimate ruler. But, historically, there's really not much evidence for Irem actually being part of the Egyptian Empire. All of the references we have from the 18th and 19th dynasty suggest that this region was, at best, a frontier territory outside of direct Egyptian rule. What that means is Sety and his representative call this a rebellion or beshtu, but perhaps it wasn't anything of the sort. Perhaps the Iremites were raiding Egyptian territory, or perhaps they were simply crossing the borders in ways the Egyptians did not like. I don't want to speculate too much on this issue, but I'm always suspicious of the word rebellion when it is used to justify military expeditions. In other words, Sety may be casting his military campaign as a response to outside aggression, but given what we know of Irem's place in the geopolitical landscape, there's very little evidence that he had any claim to rule them. The expedition to the south was cast as a response to rebellion, or beshtu. Today, we might be suspicious of that and reflect on the power politics of great empires and rulers. One thing we can say is that Sety I was interested in strengthening his power and control over Nubian lands. We know that because shortly after his victory, the king added new garrisons to the region. Around year 8 or 9 of his reign, Sety I established a new town at a site called Amara West. This is back downriver, further north from Irem, about 630 kilometers or 400 miles from the place of conflict. The area is well positioned for trade and access to the gold mining regions, and Sety's establishment of this town was probably part of that program, to control the hinterland and ensure easier access to resources. Sety's representatives established this town on a small island in the Nile. They called the village Per Men Ma'atra, or the House of Men Ma'atra, Sety. Today, it is a ruined settlement on the west bank of the Nile. The town is roughly square-shaped, about 108 meters on each side, or 350 feet. It is encircled by walls, which are 2.5 meters thick, with bastions, towers, and walkways on top that were accessible by stairs. The town seems to be a fortified administrative center. It has long, secure buildings which were used for storage, a temple to serve the people, and a sort of governor's mansion, an especially large house or palace for the king's representative. Amara West functioned as a royal town for approximately 200 years. We know that it was established by Sety I because the walls surrounding the town are made with bricks stamped with Sety's name, so there must have been a brick factory somewhere nearby producing building materials for the government in order to fortify the town. We also know that Amara West was active shortly before or after the campaign down to Irem. We know that because one of the stelae, the stone slabs that describe the campaign, was discovered in the ruins of this town. So the royal forces and the local governor apparently took up residence here late in the reign of Sety I. We can't say for sure if Amara West came first or the campaign to the south, but they're probably part of the same overall program, an attempt to increase military strength and royal control over the distant lands of Nubia. One clue that Amara West was quite an important town is the identity of its major resident. The governor's palace seems to have been home to an official who held the title Idenu en Kash. This translates as the Deputy of Kush, the senior royal representative within the region. The Deputy of Kush was a subordinate to the top official, the Sa-Nesu en Kash, or King's Son of Kush, usually translated as the Viceroy. The Viceroy of Kush was the top-level official in charge of the colonial empire, but the Viceroy spent a lot of time at court and had an enormous territory to govern, so the practical business of day-to-day operations, that was handled by the deputy. One of the deputies in the time of Sety I was a man named Sabau Khau, or the Stars Appear. We don't know much about him except that his name turns up at the city of Amara West, and it seems like he might have lived in the governor's palace. The presence of the deputy suggests that this town, far to the south of Waset, was a major part of Sety's governing program. For some reason, he chose this location to be a new fortified center of Egyptian military authority. Another deputy shows up at Amara West, a man named Heka Nakt, or the ruler is victorious. Heka Nakt is the owner of the stela that describes the campaign to Irem. It is his words that we use to describe the conflict, and it's entirely likely that Heka Nakt participated or even led a military force in the south. His service was appreciated, and about a decade after these events, in the reign of Ramesses II, Heka Nakt would receive a promotion. He was made the Viceroy of Kush, the governor of the colonial empire. His work for Sety I is the start of an illustrious record. The presence of both these officials, Sabau Khau in the governor's mansion and Heka Nakt with his stela, makes Amara West one of the more significant towns in the region. Excavations here are still ongoing, and we only have a little bit of information about life and business in the fort. But Sety's establishment of this town, and the presence of high-ranking officials, suggests that the king wanted to increase his control over southern Nubia. His motives for doing this are not hard to figure out. The Egyptians always wanted to control the river, they wanted to control the caravan routes that crisscrossed the desert, and, above all, they wanted to control the gold. Hundreds of kilometers upriver from Waset and the major Egyptian towns, a large number of soldiers and royal representatives were exerting pharaonic authority. Today, their story survives in writing and even in their homes. Finally, Sety's fleet set off from Amara West and headed north back towards Egypt. Along the way, there was one more stop to make before they could return home. In the wake of his Nubian victory, the king seems to have paused briefly in order to found a temple. This was a good way to commemorate his success and to give thanks to the gods on whom the victory depended. Naturally, this temple would be dedicated to the god Amun-Ra, who is referenced in the story of the campaign as decreeing bravery and conquest for Sety. The king stopped at a site which we now know as Beit Wali. Here, a very small temple was erected in honor of the god. Today, the temple of Beit Wali has been relocated as part of the enormous project to save temples from the rising waters of Lake Nasser. Tourists on cruise ships often stop at the temple of Beit Wali, but they may not realize that it is a commemoration of Sety's victory in Nubia. The reason for that is quite simple. Today, the decoration of Beit Wali only has the names of Sety's son, Ramesses II. However, looking at that decoration, we can tell that the temple itself was probably constructed, or at least begun, during Sety's reign, and then finished in the reign of his son. The major clue is in the style of decoration on one of the walls and in the form of Ramesses' name. The decoration itself appears in raised relief, which is very characteristic of Sety's reign, but only used at the very start of Ramesses' rule. Additionally, the name of Ramesses in this temple often appears in its shortened form, Usr Ma'at Ra, with no epithets or additional features. That is significant because Ramesses only used that short form of his name in the very first year of his rule. So the decoration was already going onto the walls shortly after Ramesses inherited power. Chronologically, that would suggest very strongly that the Temple of Beit Wali was actually founded by Sety. It was still a work in progress when he died, as were so many of his projects, and Ramesses took over the construction, finished off the decoration, and claimed it for himself. So the Temple of Beit Wali now honors Amun-Ra in the name of young Ramesses. But if you know where to look, there are clues that it originally commemorated Sety. Naturally, the decoration of this temple is devoted almost entirely to the subjugation and defeat of Nubians in battle. We see images of the pharaoh, now Ramesses, riding forth in his chariot and firing his bow into the great mass of enemy warriors. They tumble over themselves, fleeing in terror from the unstoppable onslaught of the ruler. Some of them clutch bows while fleeing headlong. In some cases, they even run into small forests made of date palm trees, as if trying to get away from the war carts which cannot easily move through the woods. The scenes are quite typical of ancient Egyptian battle imagery, but their scale is certainly impressive. And if you get a chance to visit the Temple of Beit Wali, perhaps on a cruise through Lake Nasser, you will see these images in finely carved detail. Again, while they show Ramesses, these are originally images of Sety's victory. A victory that has largely been forgotten by history, but it is preserved on the walls of this temple. Around 1296 BCE, in the winter, the king's foot soldiers and chariots went south against their wretched enemy, and on achieving victory, Sety commemorated it with a new temple for Amun-Ra. In hindsight, it would be his last victory. The campaign in Nubia was the end of Sety's military adventures. Why? Well, that is a story for another day. Thank you for listening to the History of Egypt podcast. The show will return in 2 weeks. The end of another year is upon us, along with some major festivals in the Western calendar. I'm going to spend some time with my family and enjoy a little bit of a rest. So I will see you in 2 weeks. Before I go, I'd especially like to thank the priests, my top-tier subscribers on patreon.com. These fine folks ensure that my towns flourish wherever I construct them, that I always have the essential resources, mainly coffee, and that I have somewhere to sleep while I record these ancient conflicts. My thanks to Linda, Ashley, James, Veronica, Terry, Eric, Yola, TJ, Arthur, Mycost, Karen, Andy and Chelsea, Jeffrey, Niden, and Kyla. And I would like to welcome Jeanne, who upgraded her membership to become a priest for an entire year. Jeanne, it is incredibly generous. You are far too kind. May the great Khnum, Lord of Nubia, protect you and your loved ones. To everyone listening, thank you for joining me. I will see you soon.